emceeing for today. Very simple job. So today's speaker, as you can see, is Sheikh Rami. He's a scholar, and I always love hearing him talk. But for those of you who aren't convinced, I'm going to read off a little blurb about him to convince you. Sheikh Rami is a scholar, counselor, teacher, and translator of Islamic texts. He spent 7 years studying Islam in Mauritania, which is in the northwest of Africa, and has received ijazah to teach us here today. Sheikh Rami also has co-founded Taiba Foundation, which offers Islamic education to the incarcerated men and women all over America. Sheikh Rami also holds a bachelor's in human development and a master's in educational psychology. Sheikh Rami currently resides in the Bay Area and is about to teach all of us about intention. I'll leave everyone in your hands now, Sheikh Rami. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rahim, and thank you to the whole Mina organization and everyone who organized this, and thank you to the participants for making this a reality. Without having people watch the programs or attend lessons, we can't have these programs. And one of the sayings that I learned in Mauritania is that the gift of the student is to have a teacher, and the gift of the teacher is to have a student. And so part of that process is having that relationship, the reciprocal relationship, where we have ears to listen and people can share. And then hopefully at the end, I'll leave some time for Q&A so you can ask your questions. So I'll start with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli wa sallim ala Sayyidina Muhammad. The topic that I was asked to speak about was about intentions, and specifically how intentions relate to seeking knowledge. And what exactly is seeking knowledge, and how do we as Muslims define, right? Well, I got a guest right here. My son's going to be popping in and out, might be popping in and out of the camera. How do we use those intentions to really guide our actions? And the early Muslim scholars, you know, if you've read the Muslim history, it's very interesting in that whenever they met new people and new culture and new systems of knowledge, they didn't have this fear of that new knowledge. They looked at it and they said, okay, what benefit and what good can we take out of this? So if you look at what is considered quote unquote Islamic architecture, you look throughout history, it's actually a compilation of various types of other cultures that they came into. So if you look at the iconic architecture of Qurtuba, the Qurtuba Masjid, and Spain, Islamic Spain in general, it's really a mixture of a lot of the cultures that the Muslims were exposed to. So how does a Muslim do that? How do we interact with other peoples, other languages, other religions, other cultures, other traditions? How do we take something that might have some benefit? So one of the things that the early Muslims found was they came upon cultures where people were trying to turn lead into gold, and this is the science of, or the attempt at a science of, called alchemy, of trying to turn one metal into something else. And the English word alchemy comes from alchemia, which is a word used in Arabic, but it's originally Persian. But the Muslims not only gave a word to this science that now lives on, and that's the science, the name of that science, or that attempt at science. They might call it pseudoscience, because you can't really change the structure of certain properties. You can change certain things like carbon into diamonds and so forth. And you'll hear the kids are running around here. Alchemy, one of the things that the scholar said was that intentions are like alchemy. You can take one thing, and through your intention, you can turn it from one aspect or one element into something else. So take, for example, actually, I'll share with you a story. Earlier today, I was speaking with a student of mine. He began studying with me while he was incarcerated. My main line of work that I do in the community is directing a foundation called the Taiba Foundation, Tayba, and we offer Islamic education and support other forms of other education, reentry and life skills to people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated. So I was having a conversation with somebody who was who is one of my students, and then he sent me a picture of his landscaping business, of himself doing some work with his landscaping business that he started really out of the back of his truck with one lawnmower, and they built up to now have a full crew and multiple large tools and so forth that they can take on bigger jobs. And then another student who was actually one of our foremost students at Taiba, who's memorized, I mean, just to give you an idea, he went into prison at 18 and he left at about 32. So he spent about 15 or so years in prison. But while in prison, he learned the Quran, he learned Arabic, he memorized portions of the Quran, he started studying a number of sciences. And one of the books that he read was a 1,000 line poem on Islamic law and theology, and he memorized in Arabic about 700 of those lines. It's quite an accomplishment, and he did that all while in prison. But those two brothers who were students while in prison, now they're outside and they're working, and he's showing me pictures of them while they're doing their landscaping. And so what I responded to him was with another story of when I was in Mauritania studying at the school, the Mahdara of Murabat al-Hajj, and his foremost students who are there also as teachers. And one day I was building something right next to my tent. The village is made up at the time was a few adobe structures of people who were permanent residents of the village. And then most of the students had these makeshift tent hut-like structures. So I was doing an addition to one of my tents, and chopping wood and tying things around and so forth. And one of our shuyukh, Murabat Muhammad al-Amin, walked by, and he was giving lessons to the other students, which is one of the beautiful things about Mauritania, that the shuyukh would, even in their, even as they're milking goats or cows, or even as they're walking out, they're checking on their date palm trees, or they're walking out to help the herders and the animals. They'll still be teaching, they'll still be reciting Quran, they'll still be listening to Quran and giving lessons. So you can imagine, here's the sheikh, he's walking through the village, he's giving lessons, he's tending to some needs of the village. He passes by, he sees me, I'm working, and then then I go over to say salams to him, and he said, Rami, he said, this is really good what you're doing. And then he gave me some lines of poetry, which I quickly went and grabbed a pen and a paper to write down. And the beginning of the lines of poetry is al-shughlu bil-yadaini min fi'l al-kiram wa sunnat an-nabiy sayyid al-anam. Working with your hands is from the actions of the noble people and from the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then the poem goes on to list out all of those parts of his life, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he got down and did something with his hand. He dug the Khandaq ditch. If there was an animal that needed to be butchered after being slaughtered, he would do it himself, or he could do it himself. He would also mend his own clothes, sew his own clothes, mend his own sandals, and he would do these type of things and not feel that he's beyond this. Sorry, just one moment. He wouldn't feel that he's beyond this. So it was a lesson to me and a reminder to me that, don't think yourself above doing something with your hands. But then even in that lesson, you could have multiple people. You could have somebody who's an atheist do handiwork, do hard, work by the sweat of their brow and so forth. But what's the difference? What's the difference between one person who's doing working with their hands and another person working with their hands? One person, the action is null, and there's no benefit or drawback in the next world sense, in the terms of looking at it at the akhirah. Is this action that I'm doing in the dunya, is it helping me for my akhirah, for my next life? And another person, on the other hand, where it's actually they're elevating themselves spiritually, they're purifying their souls by the same exact action. What's the difference? The difference is the intention. So one person who might be an atheist, or maybe even a Muslim, but is not consciously aware of what he or she is doing and just does the action, as opposed to somebody else who says, you know what? Or like at that point, I was building something. I was just thinking I needed to build this addition to my tent. But then our sheikh came by and he said, no, this is a sunnah to work with your hands. So then I said, oh, I can make the intention that this is a sunnah. And so that's like what the alchemists were trying to do, and taking base properties like lead, very invaluable metal, and try to turn it into gold. And that's what you can do, and that's what we can all do with our intentions. We can turn seemingly mundane acts of our day-to-day life into something that's actually an act of worship by our intention. But that intention has to, of course, be guided by the sunnah, and make sure that it's proper. An example that I give, sometimes if a person, well, I won't go into that right now, but the idea is that you can't take something that is against the Sharia, and through an intention then turn it into something that is an act of worship. So it has to be something that's permissible by the Sharia, and then you turn it into an act of worship through your intention. So I shared that with my student. I said, great job what you're doing. And this is deen. This is the deen. When people hear the term deen, or religion, or the Islamic way of life, maybe we think of worshiping, just prayer, or maybe we think of fasting, or it has to do associated with a masjid. But deen could be anything. You could worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in any place. The entire world was built as a masjid. So prayer should not only be done in the masajid, but we're actually out in the mountains right now in California, in the Sierra Nevadas. Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. All the fires have died down, and we got our blue skies back again. And now we're remembering that blessing of just having blue skies. But you can be out in the open and worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reflecting on the creation. In fact, one of the ulama, Ibn al-Hajj, who has a 4-volume book all about intentions. It's a 4-volume book just about that hadith, innamal a'malu binniyat, actions are by their intentions. So you can really make even just refining your intentions that a complete form of ibadah. But Ibn al-Hajj mentions in that book, he says, just like we should always have Muslims who are in the masajid praying, and make sure that our masajid never go empty during the times of prayers, he said we should also have people who are out in the wilderness, in the outbacks, in the trails and so forth, calling the adhan and praying, even if they're by themselves, because of the hadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that if you are in the badiyah, the outback or the wilderness, and you call the adhan, that a multitude of angels, the likeness of mountains, would pray behind you. And so he says, in this is a encouragement for a certain portion of the ummah to be out in, even by themselves, doing that sunnah. So I encourage you to do that, and for all of us to really look at our intentions and see how we can do this alchemy of intentions. So now going to seeking knowledge. So now we got this idea of intentions. We know the hadith in innamal a'malu binniyat, actions are by intentions. But then how do we apply this to seeking knowledge? Well, again, just like in that example where I was mentioning that if a person automatically connects religion or deen or worship of Allah with certain actions in certain places, the masjid, prayer, fasting. On that note, earlier today, I was reading, there's a very, very good compilation of, may Allah reward the research team who did this, but they basically compiled 50 traits, 50 good traits and 50 bad traits. And then each of those traits, those characteristics, they listed out a hadith, an ayah, a verse from the Quran, a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then sayings of the Sahaba and the early generations, the Salaf, about those concepts. So I was looking at one specifically, which is amana. And this is a really important concept. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala presented the amana, taking the amana. What is this amana? The amana of iman, of belief, but not only belief, but of having that choice, of having the choice of to believe or to not believe. And he presented that amana. He said, to the heavens and to the earth, and everything refused to carry that amana except for the human being. That was a choice that our father Adam alayhi salam made. And that's where we get our free will, because we took on this amana, this trust. But then that trust also goes from that trust of faith down to trust of making sure to pay somebody back if you borrow, or pay a good price, or not cheat, that type of amana or trust. And it's from this type of trust that and preserving this trust that our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was given the name Al-Amin, because he was so trustworthy. And he was so trustworthy and trusted by the Quraysh, to the point that even after they had chased him out of Mecca, he left Ali radiallahu anhu back in Mecca to disperse of all of the trusts, all the amanat that people had given him, because they knew him as Al-Amin. It took Ali 3 days to give everybody their trusts. Just think about that for a moment. Like, what would it take for a person who's he's looked up to in one sense? They knew him as Al-Amin. They knew him to never lie, to always be trustworthy. And they trusted him with so many things. And in fact, he brought this to their attention. In the early days of da'wah, of calling to Islam, the first 39 months of Islam, 1 year and 3 months of Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not, he told the Prophet to call people, but privately. And so that's why you only see a few Muslims have coming to Islam. If this was a live audience, I would throw this out as a quiz, but maybe I'll give you some time. In the first 39 months of Islam, how many people do you think became Muslim? And maybe I'll just leave that open. I'll come back to it, but that's a question. You can put it in the chat box, and they'll put it into the chat box here that I'm monitoring from my phone. But how many people do you think became Muslim during those first 39 months of Islam when the da'wah was private? But then the order came, وَأَنذِرْ عَشِيرَتَكَ الْأَقْرَبِينَ. Call your family, call your people, but your close people. And so he called the Bani Hashim, and he sat up on one of the hills. I believe it was Marwa. They used to have, it was one of the 2 hills. I have to check, and maybe somebody, if you know the tafsir of that ayah, please correct me. But it was one of the two hills. It was I believe it was Marwa, that they would sit upon that hill, and that would be kind of their auditorium for Quraysh. And so he told the Quraysh, before presenting the da'wah publicly, he said, you know me as a trustworthy person, and you know me never to lie. And if I were to tell you that behind this mountain there was an army preparing to attack you, would you believe me? They said, of course we would. You're Al-Amin. We would believe you. He said, then I am the Rasul, the messenger of Allah. I'm calling you to this path of Islam. And that's when his uncle Abu Lahab stood up, and he said, Tabban laka. And then the ayah was revealed, Tabbat yada abi lahabin wa tab. When Abu Lahab said that, Tabbat yada, when he said Tabban laka, basically the best approximation of what I would say is because in Arabic they say it's khasaratan lak, basically it's you're a loser. So you could imagine he called all of his family and said, I have a very important message. You know me to be a trustworthy person. I never lie. And if I told you the army was behind, what would you do? We would start preparing, because we know you would never be. You're not the boy who cries wolf. We know you as the trustworthy person. You are Al-Amin. We refer to you as Al-Amin. I'm paraphrasing their view of him. It's not the exact words of what they said, but they called him Al-Amin. They didn't call him Muhammad. They called him Al-Amin, the trustworthy one. And so Abu Lahab said, Tabban lak, you're a loser. He couldn't negate the message. He knew that the Prophet ﷺ was truthful, and he knew deep down inside that message that he was bringing was truthful, but he just said, you're a loser. Khasaratan lak, tabban lak. And so the response was, not him. Tabbat yada abi lahabin wa tab. So when you recite that surah, and it's one of the shorter surahs, so we recite it in our Quran. When you recite it, Tabbat yada abi lahabin wa tab, try to reflect on that. Here's your uncle calling you a loser, and you're Al-Amin, and in reality, you're Sayyidul Kaunain. You are the master of all creation. Of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Rabbul Alameen, the Lord of all creation, but the Sayyid. Like in a hadith, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, Ana Sayyidu waladi Adam wa la fakhr. I am the master of all of humanity, of all of the children of Adam, and I don't boast. There's no boasting about it. It's just recognizing he is khayru khalqillah. He is the best of creation. So here is a best of creation, and his uncle is telling him tabban lak. But he was Al-Amin. So I was looking at some of the sayings about amana and not having the opposite, which is khiyana, which is not fulfilling the trust. And one of the sayings of Umar, he says, I am not deluded by the prayer of a person or their fast. That's easy. Anybody can do that. I want to see somebody have amana, have trust. to be trustworthy, to be ethical. And I've had two different separate people tell me, and they're very involved. In fact, one of them is, they're very involved in the business world and the corporate world. And in fact, one of them now is very, very extremely successful and wealthy businessman. And he told me in his experience, he said, I find that the Muslims in the workplace, and he's talking about the West and even in the Muslim world, really lack ethics. Like, we really need to develop ethics. I had another person say the exact same thing. He said, you know what, he says, I know there's people who, they come to the masjid, and he's an accountant. He said, they come to the masjid, they pray, they're always in the front row, but I know their business dealings, and Muslims need to have ethics. We're not in need of filling up the masajid more, or of having more people fast. We need that, but that's not really what we need. What we need is the amana. We need people with ethics. So why am I mentioning this in a topic about intention and also seeking knowledge? Because think beyond being Muslim as just praying. We have to do that. Just like Umar radiallahu anhu, when he was dying of stab wounds after he was hit with a poisoned blade while he was praying subh fajr prayer, and he appointed somebody to pray. And imagine that he's going down and he appointed somebody to pray. Then when he came back after the initial unconsciousness, he said, did the people pray? That was his first question. And then they said, yes, they did. Then he said, La Islam liman taraka salah. There's no Islam for a person who left the prayer. Doesn't mean literally, it just means they're not practicing their Islam. But that same Umar who said that about the prayer, earlier in his life said, I'm not deluded by a person's prayer. Then he said, La Islam liman la amanata lah. There's no Islam for a person who doesn't have amana, who doesn't have trust. So if you can develop trust in your life, if you can be a trustworthy person, even if you're not getting up for tahajjud all the time, even if you're not making multiple umrahs and multiple hajjs and fasting, extra hajj, but if you're a trustworthy person, that's huge. So we have to look beyond what our cultures or even what ourselves tell us that the deen is and what's important. So intention is really important. Amana is very important in fulfilling that trust. And part of that trust is especially during your youthful years, this is the Muslim youth of North America, one of the amanas, one of the trusts that we will be asked about is our youth and how we spent it. How did we spend our youth? This is a time where you don't have as many obligations as you will, inshallah, once later on in your life, when people get married, when they have their career, when they have children, they have all of these other obligations. They have community obligations. This is a time for you to explore your spirituality, because you can go to the masjid. You don't have kids, tugging at your shirt and saying, hey, Baba, Mama, I need this or I need that. You have the freedom to explore your spirituality and to go on the Mina retreats. And inshallah, after the COVID, the Mina retreats can go back to being in person and in these type of settings where you can really cut off from society. But you have that ability to explore that. You also have the time to explore your academic pursuits, both Islamically and also in your worldly studies as well. And that's where I want to kind of end the talk, which is, I just want to make sure, when we talk about seeking knowledge, and now you're at a time in your life, the mere fact that you're tuning in to this Mina webinar shows that you're concerned about your deen, you're concerned about your Islam. It's important to you, and you want to further develop it, and you want to connect with other people who are like-minded, because there's plenty of other social media platforms that you could be on right now. There's plenty of other YouTube channels that you could be surfing. There's TikTok and Instagram and Snapchat and all of that stuff, and you could be scrolling through all of those in completely different lines of subject matter. But you're here listening to this webinar, and you might have listened to others, and you're planning to listen to more, and you're connecting with other youth who are like-minded. So you're concerned for your deen and you want to develop your deen. So how do you do that? And there may come a point where you have to make a decision. I'm Muslim, I'm increasing in my Islam, so I want to study Islamic knowledge. And when you make some of those decisions, it might come at a cost to your worldly studies. Some people might say, well, I'm not going to go to college, I'm going to go study Islam. That's what I did. I went to college, but then I dropped out of college, and I never thought that, okay, I'm going to come back. I eventually came back, after my seminary studies, and I completed my bachelor's and I completed a master's. But there was a time where I was like, no, I want to study Islamic knowledge. And there might come that point where you say, you know what? I need a break. I need a sabbatical. And I think we need to allow ourselves in the community, if somebody has that, allow yourselves, and families should allow their now young adult children to do that. If you look at the Mormon Church, which out here on the West Coast, we have a quite large Mormon population, and I grew up with a number of people from the Mormon community in high school. And one of the things that some of them do, not everybody, but after high school, they go on a mission for 2 years. Now, this mission is really, really interesting because they save up their own money, so from the time they're young, to pay for their travel and housing costs and so forth. You might see them, they're usually in pairs, they're on bikes, they're wearing a white shirt, a tie, and slacks, and they'll go door to door and they'll go, spreading their message. They're doing da'wah. But if you look at that dedication, and they give 2 years, and then they come back and they go to their college and so forth. But you could make that choice where you say, I'm going to take a break, and it's going to be a serious break, 1 or 2 years, but then I'm going to come back and I want to make sure to complete my studies, my vocational schools, my career training, whatever it might be, to then build up your career. And you might blend them at the same time. You might have, especially now with all of the online options. 20 years ago, when I made the decision, or over 20 years ago, to go overseas to study in Mauritania, there were no online colleges. There were no Islamic centers that were online. The YouTube wasn't there. You couldn't listen to all these lectures and sign up for courses. Now that option is there, so you could sit at home really and take some amazing courses with some amazing people. I just got a book today from Sheikh Farhan Zubair, who's one of the instructors at IOK, and I know Islamic. I don't know what the O stands for. Of Knowledge, Institute of Knowledge. That's what it is, Institute of Knowledge. Institute of Knowledge, and one of the teachers is Sheikh Farhan Zubair, and he sent me a copy of his newly translated, or his own commentary on the 40 Hadith. Amazing book. I know they offer some online courses. I was speaking yesterday with Mufti Abdul Wahab from Miftah Institute in Michigan. They have online courses. There's also places that you can go to study in person. There's Taysir Seminary in Tennessee. There's the Qalam Institute in Texas. There's a lot of options of where you can study Islamic knowledge online, in person, without having to go overseas. So you can blend that during your studies. But what I would say is that both are important, and both are part of your deen. Your Islamic knowledge, when we're talking about theology and really understanding our deen theologically at a deep level, is critical. You have to, especially in this day and age where there's all these overt attacks on Islam, and there's also a lot of very subtle attacks on Islam. There's a lot of people who pretend to be who want to support Muslims and support Muslim causes, but at the same way, they want to start pulling away threads of what makes us who we are. And so you have to study your theology. So make sure that you get a firm grasp on theology, on Islamic theology, on Aqidah. You also want to have a firm grasp on fiqh, on the practice of Islam, and how to practice all of the rules: prayer and purification, fasting, zakat, hajj, the rules of interaction, the rules of marriage, the rules of buying and selling. The rules of Islam. It's very important that you have a firm grasp on that. And also ihsan, the perfection of your faith, and knowing how to purify the bad characteristics, and enhance your good traits and your characteristics. So your iman, your theology, your Islam, your fiqh, your ihsan, your tazkiyah, your refining of the character, and then also knowing your society and what you need to do to interact. And then developing yourself, developing your interests. One of the things that any society needs to run, or let me put it this way: whatever a society needs to run. Actually, let me back up a little bit. Sometimes I say I have too many windows open. So there's two kinds of knowledge in this world. One is fard al-ain, individual obligatory knowledge. Every single Muslim has to learn it. And then there's fard kifaya, which is it's collective obligation. As long as we have a few people doing it, that's enough for society. So your individual knowledge would be things like the aqidah, the fiqh, the tazkiyah that I mentioned, theology, law, purification of your character, and so forth. That's every single Muslim, whether you're going to be a butcher, a baker, candlestick maker, whatever line of life you're going to go into, you need to have those and be solid on them. Not just pamphlet level knowledge, not just a couple of conferences. Study a book with a teacher, know it well, have teachers that you can go back and ask them questions, know those well. And then there's the Fard Kifaya, which is carpentry, engineering, aviation. Here we are on a Zoom meeting. There's how many millions of engineers have spent their lives studying so that now we can hold this phone in our hands and have the internet. And I'm really in a mountain town of population of maybe a couple thousand, but yet we have, so the whole industry of telecommunications and everything that allowed me to be in this at this point and to be able to do that. Well, that was a Fard Kifaya. Somebody had to do that. So whatever you find an inclination that you have a personal interest in, and you have the ability to do that, you could be fulfilling a Fard Kifaya by learning that and serving your community and humanity with that knowledge. And so that way, through the alchemy of your intention, you could turn whatever line of studies you're going to do, CPA, engineering, artist, journalist, marine biologist, astronaut. I don't want to give the cliche doctor, lawyer type things, because we don't want to, put our community into this little funnel of just like, oh, those are the only two options. But you could be anything you want. Something that I even tell my kids sometimes. I mean, this might sound shocking, but I said, you could be a street sweeper as long as you're a good Muslim. Now, and then I follow it up. I don't want you to be a street sweeper, but if you feel so inclined and that's your passion in life and you want to be a street sweeper and it's a halal income and you're a good Muslim, what's the issue with it? So I hope they don't go into the street sweeping field, street fieldologist. But if that turns out to be the case, alhamdulillah, as long as a person knows their deen, knows their fard ayn knowledge, and knows their fard kifaya, alhamdulillah. But at the same time too, one of the things, and this is where I would discourage a person from being a street sweeper, is part of your Islam and part of your deen is being self-sufficient. You don't want to have to depend on other people. And so having a good, solid career, having a good, solid income is very important for stability, not only your economic stability, but also your deen stability, because this should never be done by a Muslim asking. I know there's people in situations where they have to do that and they have to put out their hand and ask, but that's not the ideal of a Muslim. We have high ethical, high work ethic standards, and we never want to be in that position. La qaddar Allah, God forbid, if we are ever put in that position, then we know it's permissible or could be even obligatory upon us. But we work our best to never want to do this. And part of that is having that solid career. So whatever you need to do to be able to do that, then do it. And one of the things that's mentioned it's a very good book. If you have not read it, it's called Ta'lim al-Muta'allim, teaching the student how to seek knowledge. At Taiba Foundation, we have it translated. We call it our Edeb 100 course. It's available online if you type in on the Amazon, Edeb 100. There's also some other organizations that teach the same text and subject matter, but it's Ta'lim al-Muta'allim by Imam al-Zurnuji. And one of the things that he mentions in there, he says, every seeker of knowledge, every seeker of Islamic knowledge should have a career, some income, some form of income. Why? Because the student of knowledge, the seeker of knowledge, needs to be economically, financially independent so that they can focus on their studies without having to be directed by one person or another. One of the things that has happened because of colonialization, and I wonder, maybe you can mention this in the chat box if anybody's ever heard of this. Sorry, I'm just moving because the sun. If anybody's heard of this, but we always hear about what the colonial powers, what they did to the Muslim lands when they came in. Has anybody ever heard of the colonial powers and their dismantling of the awqaf system, of the endowment system that was present in the Muslim lands? Some of the most fertile lands in the Muslim culture, in the Muslim countries, Egypt and Algeria. Algeria, its land is so fertile. They have so much agriculture. And at the time that the colonialists came in, the French, Somebody told me that it was 2/3 of the agricultural land in Algeria was awqaf, was endowments. Can you imagine how much? I mean, we're talking billion-dollar industry. The same thing in Egypt. A lot of the lands, the fertile lands, the agricultural lands were endowments. Now, where were those endowments going? It was going to support a lot of things. One of the areas that endowments supported were scholars and students. Azhar has its own endowments. And so it's completely separate and independent of the government. It doesn't need government support to be able to continue running. And so scholars need that independence. Students of knowledge need that independence. So they're not dependent on the government. And we can have another session where we talk about where, as soon as scholars and scholarship begin depending on the government, and whether it's in the form of financial support or gaining prestige or getting just a pat on the back, then you start seeing those political powers utilize scholars and scholarship and Islamic figures, religious figures, to kind of rubber stamp their geopolitical moves. I don't want to turn this into a political discussion, but I just want to emphasize the point of the importance of independence. So, and I'll end on this and leave the last 10 minutes for questions. But if you find somebody who's in the masjid all the time and reading Quran, but he's dependent on people, as opposed to an Uber driver who maybe has memorized a few surahs, knows his basic Islamic knowledge, but he's working day and night to support his family, who's in a better state? We don't know. Allah is the judge of hearts, but that person who's working hard, he's probably in a better state because of having that independence. So that's what I encourage you, that maintain your career in a way that you can have independence, also that you can give back. You can do something to give back to your community, the Muslim community and humanity at large, in some way, shape, or form. And don't neglect your Islamic knowledge. You have some people who they'll go and they'll study medicine and law and all of this, and if you ask them basic theological questions, basic fiqh questions, they don't know the answers. And then you have on the other side people who know the deen, but they don't have something to make a career. So the important thing is to have a balance. And I'll leave the last 10 minutes or so for questions.
Assalamu again. Thank you so much, Sheikh Rami, for that amazing khutbah. I can't remember ever hearing that analogy about alchemy, and that really just puts that image in my head whenever I'm making intention for something else. So that's something I'm always going to carry with me. Thank you for that. And thank all of you so much for tuning in. As Sheikh Rami has mentioned, this was organized by Mina, which is a part of ISNA. And please follow us on our socials and go to minna.org for any more information, for any future events that are going to be coming up, such as ISRA, which is an 8-week intensive that's meant for our female youth. Now for any questions that we have, let me pull one up. So one question which is very applicable to all of us today watching, how do you think, how can we go back to public school having learned all that we did today and have the intention to make it for Allah? We're in biology, math, or English class and still make that for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Very good question. So the question was, how can we go back to public school after what we've learned today and still make that for intention for Allah? It's difficult. Trust me, I know. I went through a public school system, and I know it's very difficult, but it is possible. I think it's more difficult today because of the internet and social media and all of these social media platforms, and not necessarily. I'm not talking about the social, with the internet bullying aspect. That's there. That wasn't there when we were growing up, but it is there now. But I'm talking more about the influx of ideas. And ideas that are counter to our theology, to our belief as Muslims. And you'll find this, whether it's in biology. I had debates with our teachers when they were talking about, with science teachers. They were saying, oh yeah, evolution, we came from apes. Well, I'm coming from a theological view of the Muslims. We didn't come from apes. We believe we came from Adam, and Adam was created from clay, as it says in the Quran. And he had no father. He had no mother. And so I engaged in what I hope was a respectful conversation. There were other situations as well, where when things would come up, I would engage in a debate with my teachers or with my peers. Not every single time, and you don't have to necessarily have that debate. But what I encourage you is to have a solid study of theology, of aqidah, to where when those things come up, at least you can recognize them. You don't necessarily have to say something, especially if you know it's not going to be of benefit, but recognize it. And you want to recognize it before you digest it, because just like in being a consumer of products, before you ingest this product, you want to read the ingredients and say, what is this? I have a funny story. One time I was in a Whole Foods and I was checking the ingredients of something, and a lady walked by and she said, "Shalom," and I guess she, because she thought I was Jewish. Like, why else would this uh, person with a beard and a kufi who's checking ingredients? Of course, he's got to be Jewish. So shalom. I was like, no, actually, I'm Muslim. But we check ingredients before we ingest it. Well, in the same way, knowledge, we should check the ingredients. We should see at least, okay, I'm going to check this ingredients and before I make it a part of me. And so whether it's in public schools or whether it's even in um, uh, uh, books or media, late night talk show hosts. It's not just public school. It's anywhere where you have information coming to movies, music, celebrities, social media, uh, comedy, comedians. Make sure that as it comes in, you're able to analyze it and say, okay, where does this fit on the scale of the Sharia? And where is this congruent with my aqidah, and where is it not? And once you do that and they say, okay, what am I going to do with this? Am I just going to learn this and just kind of place it there? Or am I going to ingest it and say, oh, this is now, I identify with this. A short answer would be to a very, very deep and it's not an easy question to answer, but my response to your question would be study Islam, study Aqidah, study theology. And then in terms of once you see the biology, whether it's biology or even economics or history, take everything that you can and see how you can point this towards Allah. The word verse in the Quran is ayah, or a verse. It also means a sign. So when you're reading biology, how can this point you towards a deeper understanding of the oneness of Allah? How can history point you towards a deeper understanding of the oneness of Allah? How can literature point you to a deeper understanding of the oneness of Allah? And you can get that in your English class. Enjoy that literature. Enjoy fiction. It will help you understand the human nature and human condition in societies, and it can lead you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Same thing with biology. Same thing with mathematics. Same thing with all of those other subjects.
Alhamdulillah, thank you so much for that answer. Another question would be, when it comes to us hanging out with our friends, and when we're hanging out with our non-Muslim friends, we can make the intention of doing da'wah through our actions, of being just a good Muslim. But when we're hanging out with our strictly Muslim friends, what are some intentions that we can make to turn that into worship?
Good, very good question, mashallah. These are amazing questions. So when we're with our non-Muslim friends, we can make the intention that everything we're doing, we're trying to exhibit a good character. So that's a form of da'wah. What do we do when with Muslims? I would say a couple of things, and you can make actually a lot of intentions. The book I mentioned earlier called Ibn al-Hajj, the Madkhal by Ibn al-Hajj, he actually mentions over 120 intentions you can make on the way to the masjid. He mentions 90 intentions you can make going to the restroom. So the intention you can really you can add, and that's what if this was a live audience, I would tell the audience, I would say, you guys come up with the intentions. What are the intentions that you could come up with? I'll give you a few that I would make if I was with Muslims. One would be, it's fa'ida wal istifada, to benefit them. Because maybe there's an element of them that does need a little bit of calling to Islam, calling to the practice of Islam. And so I want to show them that I have that element. At the same time, I know there's elements that I have in me that I need to be a better Muslim. And so when I'm around them, I want to benefit from their good characteristics. I want to try to find truth in what we say. We want to try to arrive at the truth and a proper understanding of things and working together. So we could go on and on, but I would encourage you to come up with your own intentions on what you could have as an intention, or come up with your own ideas of what you could have as an own intention.
Thank you so much for that answer. One question that we got in the chat is they asked you to list the books that you've mentioned in your talk because they didn't write them down in time. So
Okay, sure. The book, so one of the books I mentioned was the Ta'lim al-Muta'allim, The Teaching of the Student. It's by Imam al-Zarnuji, Zarnuji. Ta'lim al-Muta'allim. There's a few different translations available online. We've translated it at Taiba Foundation. It's actually, I've translated it myself, and one of our other faculty members did an extensive commentary. It was specifically written for the prisoner student in mind, but it could benefit any Muslim and Muslims in free society. If you're interested in knowing a little bit about, you know, what Muslims experience in prison, some of our books address some of those things. So as you're gaining that knowledge, you could also say, oh, wow, this is what they're experiencing in prison. So Ta'lim al-Muta'allim is one. For Aqidah, I would say the Aqidah al-Tahawiyya. I did not mention that, but it's spelled Tahawiyya. Again, a number of different translations available online, number of different audio lectures. But if you study that book, and there are a number of commentaries you can get in English, you would have a solid foundation in Aqidah. I also mentioned the Madkhal of Ibn al-Hajj, Madkhal, and the author is Ibn al-Hajj, Ibnalhajj. It's only available in Arabic. There was an Urdu translation, but there has not yet been an English translation. And I can't remember if I mentioned any other books as well.
thank you so much for that answer. And one last question, unless we get another one, would be when it comes to buying things, whether it be a toy, a new car, whatever, even if it seems just so disconnected from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and our deen, how can we make that how can we intend that for our deen?
Oh, good question. Yeah. Again, as long as something is not against the Sharia, you can figure out a way of how to make it part of the Sharia. So, for example, if you were to say something that's like a leisurely activity, you could make the intention that I'm doing this to give myself a rest, so that I can, you know, rest my body, rest my mind, and then be able to be there and be present when I'm in my forms of worship, my fasting, my prayer, my sadaqah, when I'm with my family, so that I can be with them, or just to give yourself a break. I mean, you're doing a lot of work in the days and in the evenings, studying, worshiping, just being Muslim in this day and age. You can deserve a break. Give yourself a break. You know, have yourself whatever, coffee, frappuccino, tea, chai. You know, when you have your tea or your chai as or whatever your drink is, your fancy, as long as it's halal, of course. You know, make your intention. I'm doing this just to give myself a break and to enjoy something that's halal, and spend my time keeping up this custom of having halal food intake, rather than doing something that is accessible to you, which is haram intake. So you can be very creative with the intentions.
All right, then thank you so much. And we're going to end here. And just to mention again, this was organized by Minna, a part of ISNA. And follow us on our socials. Go to minna.org for any information about any events that are coming up. And thank you so much for tuning in. And inshallah, come back next month for our next Jumuah Gems. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you to Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.